Many of you have probably heard of this legend, and some may even have tried it. At midnight, light a candle and, facing a mirror, start peeling an apple. Be careful not to break the peel. Once you finish, the figure in the mirror will answer all your questions and grant every wish. I'm sure many have given it a try, yet hardly anyone succeeds. When it fails, people console themselves by saying it was just a lack of sincerity. But trust me, stop playing this game. The method is bogus. If it actually worked, some truly bizarre things would happen. And believe me, it wouldn't be fun at all. Back in 2006, I joined a car club. On weekends and holidays, I often attended events with the group, and we'd regularly get together for dinners and karaoke. Eventually, I opened a bar, and many of those club members became regulars. One evening, while we were drinking and chatting, a group of young people eventually steered the conversation toward paranormal phenomena. I usually just listened in silence. Some of the stuff was utterly absurd, and I didn't even bother with it, but a few details really caught my attention. This particular client heard the story from those kinds of discussions. In short, she was a young woman who had just graduated from college. She'd always been an excellent student, well-behaved, and was raised in a single-parent home with her father. Every birthday, she would announce her wish, and by the end of each year, her father would make sure it came true. One year, she wanted a new cell phone, and her father would definitely buy it for her by year's end. The next year, if she desired a new computer, he'd get that for her as well. In her own words, as long as she did well in school, her father would always provide the birthday gift she wanted, reinforcing her belief that any wish could be fulfilled. However, her most recent wish was for a car, a graduation present. Although her family wasn't poor, buying a car was still a major challenge. This put her father in a tough spot. On one hand, he didn't want to break a tradition he'd upheld for years. On the other, he couldn't bear to disappoint his precious daughter. In desperation, he learned about a method of summoning a spirit, a mirror spirit. You might find explanations of the mirror spirit on Google, but what I know from experience isn't quite what you read online. Yes, it can grant your wishes, but it comes at an exorbitant cost, usually a shortened lifespan. And much like the pen spirit, if you can't send it away afterwards, you're doomed. Legends of the mirror spirit exist all over the world, but they all work on the same principle, and the entity that appears is always the same. The mirror spirit isn't a soul inhabiting a mirror. It has no physical form at all. It's a potent force of will, an energy so powerful and refined through countless mirrors that ordinary people stand no chance against it. Our mirror spirit, Japan's Kagami no Kami, and the Western Bloody Mary are essentially the same thing. Because a mirror reflects an inverted image of reality, when you stand before one, you see your truest self, even if that truth is ugly. The mirror detects the darkness in everyone's heart and, as a result, manifests a warped kind of intent. Once summoned, it won't leave you. Wherever there's a reflective surface, the mirror spirit will be there like a shadow. The girl's father initially summoned the mirror spirit on a trial basis. When her wish was granted, he didn't realize that he was supposed to send the spirit away afterwards. Assuming that his job was done once the wish came true, he neglected the ritual, and for the next 7 days, he was tormented by a ghostly affliction. Within just over a month, he deteriorated to the point of being on the brink of death. I first heard this story secondhand from a friend who claimed it happened to one of his acquaintances, which lent it an unsettling air of credibility. Over the next few days, I managed to track down the young woman's contact information and reached out to her using my real identity. After some persuasion, she finally agreed to let me visit her father. In a hospital room in Jayajaya when I met him, a man whose pale, emaciated face looked as if he scarcely had the strength to keep his eyes open. He would gasp for breath even after a sip of porridge. After examining him, I led the young woman into the corridor outside the room and said, "I'm going to use one of our special methods to find out what the mirror spirit did to your father. Until then, you must do exactly as I say." The hospital had already issued a critical condition notice, urging them to take him home for conservative treatment since a severe myocardial infarction meant he could die at any moment. She agreed. So I placed a bowl on his bedside and dropped a degaussed piece of silver foil into it. This works on the same principle as a compass. However, because the foil floats on water, even the slightest external disturbance can alter its movement. If you're brave enough and not too scared, you can try this method yourself to see if any spirits are nearby. After several hours of observation, I noticed that the silver foil in the bowl only moved when the old man briefly regained consciousness. That indicated that his soul was entirely under the control of the mirror spirit and was on the verge of leaving his body. He was clearly teetering on the edge of death. Without intervention, he might only last a few days. From my earlier conversation with the young woman, I learned that her father's condition had come on overnight with no warning whatsoever. I know that once the mirror spirit attaches itself to someone, it doesn't care whether you're kind or how much virtue you've amassed. No matter how upstanding you are, the mirror can expose the dark side of your soul. I have the ability to send the spirit away, but I can't instruct a bedridden man to do it himself. It's all for naught. After much deliberation, I decided it was better not to prolong his suffering. I told the young woman frankly that I couldn't save her father's life. Rather than letting him linger in a state worse than death, it would be kinder to bring him to a final, clear consciousness and let him pass peacefully. Even after I explained all this, she didn't seem ready to accept it. After all, the father who had been by her side for over 20 years was about to vanish before her eyes. She told me she would give me her answer when I returned next day. Before I even arrived the next day, she had already called me. She said she'd made up her mind. Since her father's health was already failing, she planned to let him pass in comfort. The night before, she had written him a letter and intended for me to read it to him when he became a bit more alert. When I got there, both the girl and her boyfriend were present. The bed next door was empty. In a large hospital like this, doctors and nurses rarely check in on patients and their families, unless there's a pressing reason. They might be moved by the inevitability of death, or perhaps prefer not to form attachments that could unsettle them when a patient passes away. That was just my speculation. Anyway, the infrequent rounds gave me the opportunity to fulfill the daughter's wish. I asked the girl's boyfriend to step outside. First, I didn't want him to see some of our unconventional methods, and second, having him at the door served as a sort of lookout in case anything stirred. The bowl of water was still on the bedside table. I drew the light blue curtain that separated the two beds and clipped it in place, effectively enclosing the old man, the girl, and me in a small space. I then tied ropes to the four corners of the bed, connected them together, and hung them on the rack that held the medicine bottles. Next, I gathered some grave soil and arranged it around the rack. I must admit, I feel a bit embarrassed talking about this method. It wasn't my own invention, nor was it taught to me by my mentor. After I started working on my own, I learned it from a silkworm master, a practitioner from a folk sect in southwestern Guizhou belonging to the Jingyi branch. Apparently, years ago, someone refined some of these techniques and developed many new ones, eventually establishing their own school. Their approach is much like the difference between traditional Chinese medicine and Western medicine. While we use methods to address problems that have already surfaced, they preemptively block the source of the problem. They skillfully employ goo and banners, and one of their famous incantations is summon the spirits with beast bones, quench the soul and scatter grave soil. This mantra is passed down strictly from father to son. Women are absolutely forbidden to learn it. Their practices are shrouded in mystery, and in terms of effectiveness, they rank among the most formidable practitioners in the Southwest. By using grave soil to encircle the rack, secured with red rope attached to the four corners of the bed where the old man lay, any malevolent force would have to break through this formation from the outside in. That, to me, was the most ingenious aspect of their method compared to mine. After setting up the formation, I began reciting incantations to send the old man's soul back. After a while, he started to open his eyes. His spirit was clearly improved, though he remained very weak. It seemed he had forgotten everything that had happened over the past few days. Looking at me and the girl by his bedside, the very first thing he said to her was, "I dreamt of your mom." It turned out that the girl's mother had passed away a long time ago, but I knew he hadn't simply dreamed it. His soul had seen her. In his semi-comatose state, he had effectively died once, though he was unaware of it himself. The girl held back her tears as she began to recite the letter she had written for her father. I won't repeat the details. It was essentially a note of gratitude. After finishing the letter, she reached into her bag and pulled out a lollipop so big I'd only ever seen one in a Stephen Chow movie. "Dad," she said, "this is for you. Next year I'll get you another gift." Her father reached out for the lollipop. At first, he smiled happily, but soon he couldn't hold back his tears and began to cry. The girl, too, broke down, and father and daughter embraced while crying. I signaled for the girl to have a heart-to-heart with her dad, and I stepped outside to join her boyfriend. He then asked me how I could hear crying. I ignored him. I couldn't understand why anyone would ask such an inane question. Is it possible that you cried simply because the injection hurt? Based on everything I know, I couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Everyone understands that a parent's love for their child is beyond measure. No one in this world would give as selflessly as a parent. Life is full of beauty and countless touching moments, but for this girl, I hope she realizes that her father's final tear wasn't shed because he sensed his life was ending. It was for a lollipop that cost only a few dollars. It's the thought behind a gift that matters, not its price. For years, every time the girl received a gift from her father, her face would light up with joy. Yet, the one time she gave him a gift in return, it brought him to tears. Tears and smiles are simply different expressions of emotion. I hope she someday understands what it means to give without limits. I once cried while watching Hachi, A Dog's Tale, perhaps because I had never known anyone who could wait for me for 10 years like Hachi did. And in the end, seeing her cry, I knew she had come to understand the selfless love her father had given for over 20 years. After a while, I walked into the hospital room. The girl was gently soothing her father to sleep, and I said, "Maybe it's time now." To be honest, having witnessed so much death, I was able to remain as detached as the doctors and nurses around me. Of course, I'm not saying all healthcare professionals are indifferent, but this time I felt an overwhelming sense of failure. I couldn't save his life. Even the method I used to offer him one last moment of clarity was something I had only picked up in passing. That profound sense of defeat left me deeply ashamed. After the girl softly kissed her father's forehead, I cut the red thread, cleaned up the area, and he quietly slipped away. Once the death certificate was issued at the hospital, I helped the girl and her boyfriend with the funeral arrangements. After the service, I asked her to take me to her home. There, she placed 2 mirrors facing each other, stood in between them, and lit a candle. When the candle went out, she shattered both mirrors. Because 2 mirrors facing each other create an infinite reflection, this ritual prevents any lingering mirror spirits from clinging on. This is the proper way to send the soul off. From that year on, I began reading countless memoirs from my predecessors and resolved to further hone my skills so that I could help more people. If you're interested in my videos, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.